The North Western Railway has been in service for over 100 years, and even today it's ever expanding. With the rise in importing coal from the mainland, the railway was sending surveyors to scout in the hills for deposits. In 1959, they managed to find a particularly large deposit of coal south of the village of Ulvsted. The line passed through a small hamlet that had no official name, and became a part of the network, as many workmen would live in the village. For years, work at the mine was steady and plentiful, even after a serious cave-in that had caused an avalanche in the spring of '69. A year later, the mine was reopened, only life did not return to normal afterwards.
This is ridiculous. I have to run my branch line's passenger services and work at the coal mine too? How is this fair?
Toby, who was resting in the sidings, scowled at Thomas. The little blue engine had made his grievances about the new schedule very clear earlier that morning. While the other engines would handle most of the passengers and goods, Thomas was to work at the coal mine. With the many disasters the previous year, moving coal was now as important as ever to keep the railway running to make up for the loss.
I'm surprised at you, Thomas. You know Percy is still shaken after what happened there. He and his crew were lucky to survive.
But they did survive, and he was given a new coat of paint and was all smiles when he came back. Why should he have a problem with it now?
You of all engines should know how dangerous mines can be, unless you need reminding about what happened at the lead mines.
I was young and impulsive, Toby. I thought that sign meant nothing because I couldn't see any danger. Because I saw none, there had to be none. But that's besides the point. That mine was old and run down. This coal mine is only 10 years old. With all the work they put into fixing it after the collapse, it's practically brand new.
Tell that to Percy. He's made it perfectly clear he won't be setting a wheel on that branch again. Brand new or not.
Thomas hissed steam and bustled away, dragging a line of empty coal trucks up the line past the top station. The days passed, and the Lower Ulvsted coal mine was busier than ever. Thomas worked hard, but each day saw the little blue engine covered in a layer of sooty black grime. The autumn weather wasn't helping matters either, as mist and drizzle made the coal dust stick to everything it touched. At the end of the day, Thomas bumped into a line of coal trucks. They cried loudly as he banged into them.
Careful, Thomas.
Scolded his driver.
You keep bumping around like this, and you're likely to cause an accident.
It's not fair. I'm supposed to be pulling my evening passenger train, but instead Daisy is doing that. And then I have to go back to the sheds to hear James brag about that new coat of paint he was given. If I have to hear about it one more time, I'm going to snap.
Well, maybe the job you'll have tomorrow on the main line will improve your mood. Sir Topham Hatt says we are to help with removing trees too close to the main line near the bottom of Gordon's Hill and move them to the sawmill.
But then I'll be covered in sawdust.
Come on, we have one last job before we head home. We have to take those trucks to the tip.
Thomas looked at the trucks his driver mentioned. The trucks didn't look much different from the ones he was just shunting.
The tip? And why would we dump coal we just put into trucks?
Because that stuff is all waste,
said a passing miner.
That's coal and rock mixed together that isn't worth separating or burning.
Thomas still didn't fully understand, but he buffered up to the trucks and pushed them along. The line climbed around the back of a large black hill. Thomas had always thought the barren heap was the result of a fire or the avalanche caused by the cave-in. But as he pushed the trucks up to the tip, he noticed the hill was actually made of all the waste rock in the trucks.
Bust my buffers, a whole hillside of waste rock. And I thought mining had improved to prevent waste.
Thomas came to a board and stopped. It read, "Danger! Unstable ground! No engines past this board!" Having learned his lesson, and not wanting to give Toby something to tease him about, he remained behind it. As Thomas waited for the trucks to be unloaded, he looked around. From here, he could see the whole valley the Lower Ulvsted coal mine was located in. He saw the tracks go around the hill before descending down to the miner's vault, then ascending out of the valley to connect to the rest of the branch line. Thomas felt the track move a little, or so he thought it did. It seemed to sink to one side.
Did you feel that?
Feel what?
It felt like I was settling down or something.
I didn't feel anything. You, George? Nah, Frank. I was thinking about what the missus was making for supper.
Thomas sighed and thought about his own nice dry shed as a cloud of mist swirled up around him. Soon the trucks were unloaded, and Thomas brought them back down. As he did, he noticed that going backwards wasn't as easy as he thought. It was like he was going uphill before he felt the weight of the empty truck slacken. He didn't know why this was, but he kept this observation to himself. A couple days later, Thomas was back working at the coal mine. His spirits had been lifted after hearing that he would be getting a new coat of paint as a reward for rescuing James from a falling tree, but the little blue engine still had to work at the coal mine for the next few days, as a large order of coal needed to be filled. The weather had improved slightly, but remained cloudy. As Thomas came to a stop at the miner's halt crossing, he looked towards the mine. The tip loomed in the distance, a big black mountain that stood out against the green of the valley in grey clouds.
Hard to believe that's all waste rock, and there's certainly a lot of it. Lead mines didn't have this much waste rock, did they?
Hello, new engine. If you see Thomas, tell him I'm up for a race any day.
Bertie laughed as he suddenly raced past. Thomas hissed crossly and started to think of just how he'd show Bertie up. The gates opened and he puffed away. It was during the afternoon when Thomas decided to ask why the tip seemed larger than it should have been.
Well, we had to do something with the rock and earth after the cave-in. The tip was already there, so we just put the waste rock up there,
Said the foreman. Thomas looked up at the large mountain of stone. It stood against the grey sky menacingly.
Are you sure that's safe?
Hasn't been an issue before. Won't be one now.
Thomas couldn't be so certain. He decided he'd keep an eye on the tip from now on. It didn't take long for him to notice some things were wrong. Whenever he brought loaded trucks full of waste rock to be dumped, the rails seemed to slope downwards to the tip more each day. As he puffed back with the emptied trucks, he thought he could hear the sound of rocks clattering down the sides of the tip. It was during his last trip of the day when some rocks from the base of the tip broke away and fell onto the tracks. It was only a couple large rocks, but the crew stopped anyway.
Can't risk derailing if we hit that. We'll quickly clear the way and get this lot finished.
As the crew left, Thomas looked up at the tip. It loomed over him, towering even over the mine shaft and its offices. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt very uneasy. This feeling didn't leave the pit of his smoke box until he was puffing down the line back to his shed. The sky was dark. Thunder crashed overhead. The rain poured down, but still Thomas shunted trucks around the yards. The tip stood darkly against the sky, seeming to touch the black clouds.
I'll be glad when this job is over.
His crew left to talk to the foreman, leaving Thomas alone. As he sat, there was a deep rumbling sound. Thomas looked and saw the tip had moved. It was closer now.
I must be seeing things.
Another rumble, and the whole mountain of rock moved closer, as if it was gliding towards him in one large mass. The tracks at the edge of the yard disappeared, followed by a shed, then a water tower, then one truck, two trucks, three, as the mass of rock moved forwards, rolling over and burying anything in its way. Thomas whistled in fright. He wanted to run, but he couldn't without his crew. Before he could say anything, the mountain of rock rolled over the sleepers and some rocks thudded down on his footplate, smashing his lamp. Thomas went to close his eyes, but instead, he opened them. The bright sun shone in and blinded him. For a second, he didn't know where he was, but then he realized he was in his shed. The cleaner was just mounting his headlamp, and Daisy purred past on the opposite line with the first passenger on of the day. Thomas sighed deeply. It had only been a dream.
The sooner this job is over, the better.
The trucks laughed and swayed as Thomas pulled them up the grade. More coal waste had been dug out and loaded into trucks in the lower yards located below the main offices instead of the upper yard. Thomas grumbled as the silly trucks made his job more difficult.
Oi, quickly, shunter. You want to be unloaded today, not next week. He's a station pilot. They don't know the meaning of the word.
I thought the mine owned him.
Shut up!
Then, just as he was about to crest the top of the hill, the coupling on the lead truck ripped right off. The trucks laughed and screamed as they raced to the bottom. Shunters dove out of the way as the trucks raced for the bend in the tracks leading out of the mine. The trucks were going too fast, and they leapt from the rails at the bend. They landed in a heap, spilling waste rock everywhere.
Oh, bother. At this rate, Sir Tom might change his mind about that new coat of paint.
The trucks just laughed rudely, pleased with themselves. There was no time to clean up, so they were left where they lay. They were still there when it was time to go home.
See you tomorrow, Thomas.
One more day, Thomas. Then it's out to the works for that new coat of paint Sir Topham had promised.
His driver said as he tucked his engine in the shed.
Wonderful driver.
Thomas said with a deep yawn. The shed doors were shut, and Thomas quickly fell asleep. Thomas couldn't help but smile as he rolled along his branch line with Annie and Clarabelle singing happily behind. He'd just left Elsbridge for a guaranteed connection with Henry, and was now venturing higher into the hills. It was fields of green grass as far as the eye could see. The green soon turned to brown earth as he passed by the field Terence would plough. But then Thomas noticed something. The field seemed to spread out further than it should. It spread up the hills on both sides of the line up to the tunnel.
This doesn't look right.
As he plunged into the tunnel and then came out the other end, the whole countryside had changed. Bushes and trees had all vanished, and the ground was instead covered with rocks that were as dark as the ballast. He saw all this, but he couldn't speak. Thomas felt compelled to just watch as he journeyed up his branch line, which now looked completely alien to him. The rocks covering the landscape around him never changed, but they did get thicker. As he passed Hackenbeck, the station's platform was level with the ground. Looking ahead, Thomas saw his rails were no longer riding on top of the rock, but below it in a trench. His coaches still sang behind him, as if oblivious to the changing landscape. A couple gusts of wind hit him in the face, and Thomas wrinkled his nose. The air smelled of damp coal.
This isn't right. Something's wrong.
But the little blue engine could do nothing but continue up the line. Mrs. Kindly's cottage was buried in the black rock. Only the roof could be seen. Through another tunnel and out the other side, the rock now towered over the rails. Thomas had never felt more trapped in his life. This was no longer his branch line, it was a maze of trenches made of this black rock that at parts looked like coal. A rock fell on Thomas's roof. Another rock fell and hit Annie's roof, but she continued to sing, oblivious. This was too much for Thomas. He wanted this to end. More rocks fell from the towering cliffs that stood above him and smashed on the rails in front and behind. A rumbling sound filled the canyon. Before Thomas could think the word, the walls of the canyon gave way and slid down to envelop him and his train completely. There was no escaping it now, trapped in the darkness as the earth rumbling became deafening. The rumbling awoke the blue engine. His eyes shot open and darted to the shed windows. Outside, Henry rattled by Tidmouth with the flying kipper, the sky a dim blue with the rising of the sun. Thomas yawned and huffed to himself as he drifted back to sleep.
Just one more day. One more day.
The mine hummed with activity as Thomas shunted his train of empty trucks to the shaft. Once the trucks had been secured to the mechanism, he went to the yard to take some loaded trucks to the tip. As Thomas reversed out of the siding, the derailed trucks at the bottom of the yard chuckled dryly. Thomas felt a shiver run down his boiler, but he pressed on. Up the steep tracks Thomas went, pushing the silly trucks. A clattering sound of rocks grabbed his attention. It was then Thomas noticed the slopes around the tip had seemingly moved closer to the tracks, grown closer and higher than even the day before.
Can't be that much waste rock in the mines, can there?
Thomas stopped at the board and waited patiently while the workmen unloaded the trucks. Down below the tip, he could see the small miner's halt. Flashes of red paint down below hinting Bertie was just making his way up the valley. Slowly, Thomas's mind returned to the sights he'd seen coming up the tip this time. The derailed trucks from earlier, the rocks tumbling down from the tip. Why were these suddenly sticking out in his mind? Then, a rumbling sound suddenly cut through the sound of the trucks being unloaded, followed by a distinctive sinking feeling. Thomas didn't have time to wonder what was happening, as a miner suddenly cried out,
The tip's collapsing! Evacuate immediately!
Thomas's driver opened the regulator, and the engine leapt back so quickly he nearly pulled the truck's couplings off. Thomas could see a sudden growing void as the ground crumbled away. One worker vanished from sight, another followed, one leapt over a growing chasm as the chunk of land he had been standing on disappeared. Thomas realized he'd seen this, only this time, this was no dream.
Faster! Faster!
The trucks weren't laughing either. They were scared too. They screamed and pleaded for Thomas to go faster. He crested the top of the hill and began to race backwards down the other side. The trucks now bumped into him, pushing him along. The entire mountain broke apart and slid downwards. The noise was awful. The tip's peak getting shorter and shorter before it slowly came to a stop. Thomas kept puffing. He didn't get much further before his brakes came on. It was lucky his crew had done so, or else Thomas would have derailed into a landslide that had swallowed the tracks behind him. Still, the sounds of rumbling, crashing could be heard as the landslide continued out of sight.
Oh gosh. We got away.
That was too close. My God. I know what happened. But what happened? I think we should make sure the mine calls the emergency services.
While his crew left for the offices, Thomas looked up at the tip, which was now a fraction of its former size. Looking back, it didn't appear to have slid down into the yard. The only other way the landslide could have gone was down the line, towards the halt, where Bertie was. Thomas felt a sickness in his boiler. He just stared blankly into space as the rumbling from the other side of the tip was joined by distant crashing and smashing before it all subsided into silence. It took a long time before the small landslide was cleared, and Thomas was able to back down to the yards. He looked down the valley towards the halt. The trees that had once hidden it from view had been replaced by rocks. The tops of some buildings could be seen in the distance, but there were fewer buildings than before. A breeze blew across the valley, and Thomas was hit by a wave of moisture that smelled of damp and coal. He wondered where that was coming from. The weather had been dry for the past couple days. Thomas looked up to see a familiar red shape tearing into the yard. It was Bertie. The red bus came to a stop in the car park, and immediately miners started to pile in the back.
Bertie, you made it.
Thomas! Oh, yes, I did. I just barely avoided the worst of that slide. Oh my gosh, it's horrible. We need all the miners down at the halt.
Thomas's heart sank. He figured he knew why that was. Once the last miner who could fit in climbed aboard, Bertie tore out of the parking lot, leaving the blue tank engine all alone, trapped in the mine he would have given anything to never come back to. It took some time before the line could be cleared. Thomas was soon out helping Toby, who brought more workers to help dig out. The tram engine noticed the downcast expression on Thomas's face. Knowing the thoughts likely swirling in his smokebox, Toby said nothing. Inspectors then came, followed by Sir Topham Hatt.
It's simple, sir.
An inspector said.
The mine tailings became saturated by the rain until it collapsed. The railway is not at fault.
You can share that. But the railway's need for coal brought the mine company here. And look what happened. 5 people lost their lives today. He then paused and turned to the inspector. I suspect the mine will be shut down permanently because of this.
They were barely holding on after the first collapse. This has spelled the end for them.
It's probably for the best. He looked over at his engines and sighed. As he turned and headed back to his car, he said to himself, "I've got a lot of arrangements to make." And a few weeks later, the mine was no more. All coal that had been dug up was sold off, with the money going to the survivors from the halt who later moved up to the town of Ulfstead. The halt was abandoned, and for years nothing grew in the black stone-covered valley. From then on, when visitors would ask the people of Ulfstead about the valley, they simply called it the Barrens.